thank some of the people I have worked with, Warren in particular, who has done a wonderful job first coming into the Dean's office to ask for our help and also helping to organize things and make things clear. So thank you, Warren. You've been a great help. And it's been a real privilege to be here. So without further ado, why don't I read my paper, which hopefully won't go too long, but time will tell. This essay argues that the Sri Lankan government's constructed definitions of Tamils as quote-unquote terrorists, separatists, and anti-national is an attempt to disguise state violence against the Tamil community in Sri Lanka as anti-terrorists as opposed to state-generated violence, better called genocide. This state-generated label, I argue, is designed to enforce majority Sinhalese control over the government in Sri Lanka and to allow the ruling elite to maintain power. This state-based violence is more, I argue, than a human rights violation, but with Professor Bowles' convincing argument yesterday, it was genocide. Such an argument raises the vexed question of how to define genocide, which Professor Bowl handled very well yesterday, thank you. So that means we get to skip part of my paper, and that's good news for everybody. So I don't need to go over the definitions of genocide, because yesterday Dr. Bowl did that for us in a manner that is much more convincing than I could have. But the other question I wish to raise in this paper is why the Western media avoids any reference to this term in the nearly 1,000, well, to be precise, 999, newspaper articles on Sri Lanka that I have read from a variety of Western newspapers from Canada, the United States, Australia, England, and New Zealand. Central to my argument in this paper is that the way the Sinhalese Sri Lankan government of Kumaratunga and others disguised their atrocities and genocides of Tamils was to frame Tamils as terrorists attempting to destroy a democratic nation-state. These claims of democracy and terrorism are, I will argue, ways of framing the rulership of Kumaratunga as positive, liberal, and progressive, and ways of framing the Tamil community as terrorists and anti-national. There is, however, a significant gap between this framing of these notions and the reality of what happened in Sri Lanka that is best defined as genocide perpetuated by a corrupt and undemocratic government. Much of the control and dissemination of information that the Sri Lankan government was able to manipulate was facilitated through their control over media, both in Sri Lanka and internationally. As we learned yesterday, in Nir Manusam's excellent paper, during the states of emergency declared by the Sri Lankan government and at other times, the Sri Lankan government controlled Sri Lankan media, as did they censor and edit the stories produced by outside journalists working in Sri Lanka. As has been argued by a variety of scholars, the media are a primary means of generating interpretations of groups, events, and ideas, as well as a sense of national identity and the dissemination of national agendas. As such, the control the Sri Lankan government had over Sri Lankan media and the resulting ability to control the dissemination of information to media outlets overseas gave them the power to frame both themselves and Tamils in ways that allowed for genocide to occur without significant international criticism of the Sri Lankan government for generating these mass atrocities, largely because they framed Tamils as terrorists, particularly after 9/11. Before I present some specific examples of this media framing and how Western media outlets accepted it uncritically, I will briefly discuss the theory of media framing as it has been developed by Robert Entman. Media framing can be the conscious or unconscious choice of newspaper editors and journalists to highlight certain aspects of a narrative so that certain conclusions result in the readership. Framing essentially works through selection and salience. In other words, choices made by editors and journalists as to what will make the news, how it is presented, and the repetition of such frames has a significant impact on how the media audience understand and react to reports. Another way of understanding Entman's theory is that if you continually see the headline that reads Tamil terrorist, it becomes ingrained in people's mind. They never see another report. When they do see alternate views or other reports, they question the alternate report because they have been ingrained into this one way of seeing things. So media framing becomes very important in terms of how the broader, let's say, Canadian, Australian, British, and American public understand events in Sri Lanka, because as we'll see, they never actually hear the voices of Tamils. Entman's analysis of media framing stresses that frames often identify what a causal agent has done and the benefit or damage of those actions. The evaluation of the benefit or damage of the causal agents are typically measured by common cultural values. Once Sri Lankan Tamils are framed as terrorists in newspaper outlets and are presented as the causal agents of much of the violence in Sri Lanka, the common cultural values used in media sources often relate to the international war against terror. So it becomes tied with that. So the common cultural value is related to this other broader global campaign after 9/11. And this then gets reinforced with the notion of international media. Hence, the reading public comes to view the violence in the state of Sri Lanka that the Sri Lankan government perpetuates as both legitimate and somehow supported by Western states. Within the Sri Lankan context, where there was no freedom and still is no real freedom of the press, the way to frame Tamils as terrorists attacking a democratic nation state is particularly amplified, particularly after 9/11. This mode of framing Tamils in Western media outlets places them in a category in much of the Western public's mind as legitimate targets for state-based violence, as did it lead to governments like the United States of America and others to label the LTTE as terrorist organizations. I am not here arguing that all acts of violence are justified or that something called terrorism does not exist. But with scholars such as Sean Kaplan in his article 3 Prejudices Against Terrorism, a careful and critical examination of the possible moral justifications of the violence perpetuated by so-called terrorists is needed, because without a sense of the context and what has led to that violence, all the label that terrorist does is trigger a red button in people's minds. They will not then look for more context. They will not desire to understand. All they see is the word terrorist, and that sets off a red light in their heads. So with him, that sense of context, what actually happened, what is motivating people to push back against a nation state, becomes the central feature that is not covered in the media for the most part. Once, though, a group is labeled as terrorists, such careful and critical examinations of context and circumstances disappears from the media context, largely because of assumptions around the nature of terrorism and those that carry it out. Hence, once the LTTE are framed as terrorists by the Sri Lankan government, and then this frame is perpetuated in Western media sources, the context of state-based violence in Sri Lanka is either simply ignored or vastly underreported. Much of this framing of the LTTE appears when Chandarika Kumaratunga becomes the president of Sri Lanka. She is framed in media sources, particularly Western media sources, as a democratic leader seeking peace through negotiations with the Tamil people. The reality of the violence perpetuated by the Sri Lankan government against Tamils is rarely presented in such reports. There are occasional references to discrimination against Tamils and occasional accounts of state-based violence against Tamils, but once again, such accounts are likely dismissed by a readership that has already accepted the framing of Tamils as quote-unquote terrorists. During Kumaratunga's rule, Her voice and view of Tamils dominates Western media sources. We never hear the voice of Tamils unless they are presented as advocating for violence against the state. When Kumaratunga says what Kumaratunga says matters within the context of media framing, because the media tends to report primarily on what people in positions of power do and say. In other words, we hear an awful lot about what President Trump does and says, what Prime Minister Trudeau does and says. Well, that sells newspapers or gets people to click on your website. So it's not that uncommon that the main voice is often a president or prime minister, but that's also often been the bias of the media. They are only interested in hearing that particular voice. So hence the ability to frame one's own character and those of others is often in the hands of presidents, prime ministers, and others in positions of power on the world stage. In many of the Western newspaper reports of Kumaratunga, she is presented as a peace negotiator who will bring about an end to ethnic violence in Sri Lanka. She is often framed in a positive manner. But after she is nearly assassinated by a suicide bomber, and then after 9/11, the framing shifts. We read, for instance, the following quotation from her while in hospital after an attempt on her life. Quote, "Let all those who aid and abet terror be warned. Let those who secretly or openly condone the path of violence pursued by the cowards of the LTTE be warned. The days of terror in this land are numbered," and that number is small. So that appeared in December 23 in 1999 in a newspaper called the Sydney Morning Herald. It also appears in about 15 other newspapers, Canadian newspapers, American newspapers, other Australian newspapers. So this was a widely circulated piece. What I want you to notice is that terror keeps showing up, and that's not accidental. She is trying to frame Tamils as terrorists, and that then becomes the lens that Western governments and the Western media start to see Sri Lanka through. There was also a series of newspaper stories in America, in American, Canadian, Australian, and English newspapers, with Kumaratunga blaming the Tigers for trying to kill her and engage in terrorist activities. The New York Times, for instance, not long after the attempted assassination of Kumaratunga, presents the following article with the headline, quote, "Injured Sri Lankan leader urges Tamils to help end terrorism." We are told in this article that Kumaratunga states that, quote, "The Tamil people must clearly and without hesitation decide whether they are going to continue to strengthen the hand of terror and murder by their secret, silent, or partial support of the LTTE," end quote. Well, actually not end quote. Ms. Kumaratunga said in English during a 5-minute radio and television address to the country. Now, end quote. Much of this framing of a supposed democratic leader who had nearly been assassinated by supposed terrorists is also accepted by political leaders in the West, such as the following quotation from Bill Clinton. He is quoted as publicly stating, "It is particularly distressing to me that these heinous acts have occurred during a democratic election campaign," end quote. The nature of the Sri Lankan democracy has been rightly critiqued by scholars such as Neil Devota, and what is also clear from Clinton's comments is that the framing of Sri Lankan politics as presented by Kumaratunga and then through the press, in other words, that the struggle in Sri Lanka is between a democratic nation and a terrorist group, has been accepted and reinforced by Western media sources and also then by Western media political leaders. In other words, it's one thing for the newspaper to make the claim. It is then another thing for the President of America to get up and make the same claim. It just reinforces the frame over and over again. After 9/11, the framing becomes much worse of Tamils as terrorists. And it becomes a much stronger presence in media reports on Sri Lanka around the world. In an edition of The Australian, for instance, we read the following. quote, Sri Lankan President Chandrika Kumaratunga, in a rare broadside against Tamil Tiger rebels. I find that very ironic, a rare broadside. That largely infers that they have no sense of the context in Sri Lanka. Anyway, against Tamil Tiger rebels says there is evidence linking the guerrillas to the assassination of Foreign Minister Lakshman Chandirgamar. Mr. Chandirgamar was gunned down on Friday night at his home in the capital, Colombo. He was a vocal critic of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam and played a key role in the group's prescription as a terrorist organization in several countries, including the US. Mr. Chandirgamar was an idealist, so this is a quotation from the president, was an idealist long before September 11th and the London bombings, long before terrorism became an anathema in the Western world. He spoke out against terrorism in Sri Lanka and abroad, Ms. Kumaratunga said. He was instrumental in having the LTT recognized internationally for what they are, an armed terrorist group, end quote. Once this frame of a democratic country fighting a terrorist group has been established in Western media sources, this frame comes to dominate most Western newspaper reports of Sri Lanka, with Tamils repeatedly presented as terrorists fighting a legitimate democratic government. After 9/11, one mostly reads accounts of violence on the part of Tamils in Sri Lanka, almost always presented as terrorist attacks. One rarely reads about the violence of the state against Tamils. With this frame established, we read accounts such as the following in Western media sources. On this night, she, that is Kumaratunga, tells the people of Vayangoda, is that close? Okay. That peace is at hand. Now, we all know that this is just not true, but again, because the media presents it, people will not question it. The government forces are now entering the final phase of defeating the terrorism of the LTTE, she says. Almost 75% of the land and the Tamil civilian population have been liberated from the grip of the tigers. But the war will not be a complete solution. We must address the genuine and legitimate grievances of the people. What I hope you see here is how media framing works. They are terrorists. I am going to help them because I'm some sort of a just democratic ruler. Well, we all know that is just not true. But that's the only voice that ever appears in the media presenting these claims. So what we see here then is a framing of Kumaratunga as conducting a quote-unquote legitimate war, and that she has genuine concerns from the Tamil people. We know that this is not the case, but the reading public has no means of reaching an alternate conclusion than the one they have been provided by the media. There are, to be fair to the media, occasional references to Sinhalese discrimination of Tamils, but any context or accurate account of what the Sinhalese state has done or is doing to Tamils in Sri Lanka is never carefully explored in these media sources, nor do they ever directly speak with Tamils, as far as I can see anyway in the 999 articles I have read. Rather, an image is created of a radical extremist group trying to terrorize a nation and its people, and hence the violence of the state becomes, at least in the eyes of the West in the fight against terrorism, justified acts of violence in the war against terrorism. Hence, by framing Tamils as a terrorist threat to a democratic state, the Sri Lankan government is able to disguise its genocide of Tamils as a fight against terrorism. So that's why media framing matters. You never ever see the word genocide in any of these reports, even though we now know that is the correct term. All we see is the word terrorism, and that a prime minister is somehow fighting some sort of a just war. Now, in fairness to the Western media, there are references to state-based atrocities against the Tamil community in some newspapers. Once in a blue moon, the Globe and Mail does that, and so does the Star. One of the London newspapers occasionally will make reference to this, but never with the voice of a Tamil. So you never actually hear what has actually happened. There are vague references to atrocities, but always as the next step in an article that started with the word terrorism. So for the reading public, are the atrocities those of the terrorists, or is it state-based atrocities? Is never made that clear in the articles. So it's not that they never say there is no state-based violence, but often that state-based violence has already reflected the frame of terrorism, and for the reading public who knows nothing about what is actually happening in Sri Lanka, how they read that word atrocity is not clear at all. We would have to do some sort of psychological test in a large group to actually figure out how it got read. So, yes, some of this is assumption on my part. We do have also occasional references to government-sponsored death squads in some media sources. Again, some. This is a tiny number of the 999 articles I have, so I would estimate somewhere between 2 and 3% make side references to these points. But such references are never given any context and may well be dismissed by a readership that is rarely given a Tamil perspective on what the government is doing in Sri Lanka. Hence, when a Western reader with little understanding of what is and what was actually going on in Sri Lanka reads reports of terrorist violence in Sri Lanka and then also reads comments about atrocities in Sri Lanka, the probable assumption on the part of the reader is to assume that such atrocities are conducted by terrorists and not by the state. To conclude, I am not arguing that the media are not a source of meaningful information. Far from it, the example of Sri Lanka highlights the need for a free press. So one way the press could have covered Sri Lanka was to have reporters in the field gathering evidence and publishing that evidence. That they were not permitted into the field, and the only source of information they had was essentially from the Sri Lankan government. That's how this framing takes shape. For instance, if images of the genocide of Tamils in Sri Lanka had circulated in Western media sources, the perception of the Tamil Tigers in the West would have likely have been much different. Here I'm thinking of the images of Syria, of people carrying corpses of children around. That has an impact on most of my colleagues here at the university, that they can't believe that this has been allowed to go on in Syria. People need that context to see what is actually happening, as opposed to the way the Syrian government frames it, that they are going against terrorists, not trying to control and seize power. My concern with the case of Sri Lanka is similar to that of the first keynote speaker then, in that states like Syria, India, and Kashmir, and others have learned how to conduct violence against their own people by framing those in opposition to them as terrorists. In other words, it is both a Sri Lankan issue and problem, but one that the rest of the world seems to also mimic, to realize that there are ways of carrying out genocides and hiding it by claiming that the people you are killing are somehow deserving of death. So I don't have it here with me, but there is a quotation from the then Prime Minister where she says, "It is justified to kill the killers," is her claim. And that was circulated in nearly 20 Western newspaper sources, the Times, a whole series of other newspapers. And no reporter ever questions that. It is just presented as a quotation without commentary, thought, or other view presented. So again, it's not that I think the media is not useful or doesn't have the potential to be useful, but only if the media is permitted to be free and have access to things. The other issue with the media at the time when most of these newspaper reports were coming out, particularly in the 80s and early 90s, was there have been a number of studies of Canadian and American media outlets that were more or less staffed by white North Americans. The absence of minority populations as reporters or as deliverers of the news had a significant impact on how things got framed. Other people do bad things, and we have to stop other people from doing bad things. There has been a shift, at least in Canadian media sources, to try to, the CBC, for instance, has tried to indigenize parts of its media outlets. We see more minority groups represented in media, and it has shifted the way groups get framed in media sources in quite a positive way. Thank you. Now perhaps there is time for questions, quandaries, quibbles, moments of quiet disillusionment that you would like to express.
I think you hit the nail on the head correctly. That the government of Sri Lanka hired a well-potential, which is a notorious image organization, which supported many world leaders who were committing genocide.
Ah.
The equation they created was camels equals tigers equals terrorists.
Yeah.
And I think they succeeded in that image of the three words, and that kept repeated again and again. As a result, if you notice, no other person other than Tamils participated in any of our struggles in Canada.
Yeah.
We had tens of thousands of people on the streets. We had 30,000 people for almost a month in Ottawa in front of the parliament, but nobody bothered to come. Not even the MPs, except for 2 people came out. The reason was the government succeeded in framing this as a fight against terrorists, so if you are Tamil, then you're a terrorist.
Yeah, and I think it's that inability of both our own governments and our own media to question the frame they have been presented. Part of the danger is that word terrorist will sell newspapers. Good news does not sell newspapers unless it's sports or music. Bad news does sell newspapers. So there had been, at least in media sources, a tendency to stress the bad news, because that was how you got people to buy your newspaper. Now that newspapers don't exist that much anymore, they're somewhat more liberal, but yeah, I agree.
So in your mind, what can we do to overcome this?
I think part of that we've already heard from the student panel and the documentary we saw today is there are now ways to present your narrative and your story, both through the documentary, which is able to sort of touch other nerves that people will understand and comprehend in a way that just hearing someone like me say things will not necessarily touch that same sense. In other words, it's an alternate frame and a powerful frame, which is what makes it useful. And then the use of other media sources to present the case. I think that's what becomes a very useful way of changing the narrative and the frame, that there are ways of convincing the current media outlets to see a different picture. Other questions, queries, comments, quibbles? Someone must have a quibble.
Say something as a former member of Parliament Sri Lanka and also a member of the Transnational Development Council. More than these 2 labels, what is important to you and to all of us here. I was a victim of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 1979. 59 years have rolled out. Things remains unknown to me. So I was working in the central bank. I addressed a meeting in Allahabad on the destruction of Hindu temples. The central bank interdicted me and followed by the Anti-Terrorism Act. He said, J.R. Jawaharlal was the president at the time, said, wipe out terrorism. Oh no, before 31st December 1979. I was arrested, kept there for 3 months, stripped naked often. Physical injury was less, but I witnessed how young boys were tortured and then after kept in comedy Karu, they said all what evidence show that you are not a tiger, you are not a terrorist, but you are adamant on the issue of murder. I said to be adamant on the issue, he said it's sin, and you took more than 3 months to say it. This as regard the terrorist act. I don't want all the others. I got equally interesting things. Then about my friend Laxman Kadaga, when I was an MP, I told him, we have got an Oxford accent, unmatched by anybody. I feel we are equal to the task. But I told him, you are guilty of going around the world, being born as a Tamil, to classify the tigers as terrorists. Tigers are not terrorists. They are only fighters for, he said it's a relative term. I said, that is your point of view. But evidence shows you are going around the world, paid by the Sri Lankan government to sell the Tamil community. I said, unbecoming of you or the foreign minister behaving this manner. Then coming to Chandrika, my friend too, when she became the, I congratulated her. And later when things went changed over, many things that happened. First letter when I wrote to her, she thanked me. Second letter when I wrote to her, second letter I wrote to her, there was no reply. When I met her person and said, how do you conduct yourself? She put a smile and said, well, that's politics. Thank you.
Any other, perhaps very quick questions?
This is a very quick question. You were mentioning about powerful people have to be take a side and inform about the diaspora. This is what. What I am thinking is, do you think that Canadian Prime Minister or American President can help us on this matter?
I don't know. I don't speak for them, but I think asking is where you begin. Presenting the case is partly where you begin. So I think that's part of it is don't give up trying. I think is an essential sort of message that in the past, when you looked at the government of Stephen Harper and others, no, they were not sympathetic. That word terrorism clicked a button in their heads and they simply would not engage, as far as I'm aware, with the community or the issue. There are slightly different leaders now, but whether or not they are prepared to listen or how they might act remains sort of an open question. But I think it would be a mistake not to try.
I think we lack a word here. Those who commit terrorism are called terrorists, but those who commit genocide, we don't have a word to describe that.
We call them presidents or prime ministers, I'm afraid. So it is, because they sort of carry that stature, and the way the media frames leaders is often through that stature, unless they can find a way to present them in a very negative light. So often that framing is also around your own national identity. So American framing of situations in Syria, for instance, is often quite sympathetic to the Syrian people, largely because the sense of American national identity views the leadership in Syria as a potentially bad group, potentially. So there are other ways of looking at these things as well. But should you have any quibbles, I'm always open to quibbles. You can catch up with me at lunch or